the human nature can be defined in different ways. For instance, standing up so that we can move along more easily, freeing the hands for doing different things. That's one way. Another way is the opposition between the thumb and the index. This gives us a fine dexterity. Another one, the vocal apparatus, which allows us to produce all sorts of sounds which constitute our language. All these are important in a way, but I think the most important ones are the cognitive functions. They depend on specific networks within the brain, hence the title. They are different. They set us apart from non-human species and still from artificial intelligence. And they have evolved progressively in Homo sapiens, in us, in mankind. Now, it's not an exhaustive list, but you have spoken and written language, verbal and non-verbal communications, arithmetic, music, abstract thought, consciousness, self-awareness, intentions, imagination, creativity, decision-making, strategic thinking, social interactions, theory of mind, emotional control, behavior, personality, spirituality, knowledge, expertise, spatial representation, managing the material world, ability to learn, to create, and to advance knowledge. This is not exhaustive, and don't be afraid, we won't deal with all of them. I have chosen 3 examples: language, theory of mind, and expertise, to illustrate how they are organized, why they differentiate us from non-human primates, for instance. Now, my other point will be, it's not brain alone, but it's the interaction between us, represented by our brain partially, and the culture which makes us human beings. Now, first of all, the human brain, for those who are not in the field, here's a brief sort of summary. There is a frontal, sorry, I need laser. This one doesn't work. Sorry. Yeah, thank you. This is the brain of a person, of a living person, imaged with magnetic resonance machines, scanner, and reconstructed by by programs. You look from the top, you look from below, you look from the left side, and this is a horizontal section. We distinguish frontal parts, which are in the front, occipital parts in the back. There is one part which we'll be talking about, is the frontal lobe, which is lateral here and below. And then one important thing is visible here. This is the small band of gray matter all along the surface. This is the cerebral cortex, which is very important for cognition. Now, in others, there are a few specialized parts which are illustrated. The part which receives first visual information is here, auditory information here, somatosensory information in blue, and the part which is the final path for motion in red. These are the simple parts. All the rest of the brain, which is in gray, deals with these aspects, but also with a high-level cognition, and is organized in networks. Here is an example from what we can see in a post-mortem human brain, trace connections within the cerebral cortex. We can see partially, we put a dye here, and there are axons going out. Here we have a detail of a neuron with this axon coming out, and this is part of the dendritic arbor with the spines which receive part of the connections from other neurons. It's very complex. We know that it is similar in the building as building block to non-human species, but there are also differences, and we will see them later on. Now, the first cognitive function which we will see is language, communication, which we use. Well, the person to name is Paul Broca. He was not completely the first one, but in the 1960s, 1860s, he published a very interesting case of a patient who lost the ability to speak. This patient said one single word, tan, all the time, couldn't say anything purposeful. Later on, the patient died, and as was the usage at the time, Broca did an autopsy, took out the brain, and looked at it. The brain finished afterwards in a museum in Paris and was taken up by colleagues, Nina Dronkers and her colleagues, and they put it into an MRI machine to see how it's constituted. What Broca saw was the outside, and he saw a small lesion on the left side in the anterior part, in the frontal part. And he said, our ability to speak depends on the left half of the brain and on the anterior part. That was true, but what revealed the imaging in this century, 150 years later, was that the lesion was very large, huge, inside the hemisphere, and in fact much more was damaged, but this is a detail. People after Broca, researchers from different other countries, have described other types of language problems, and we came out to a more complex model of speech and language processing in the brain. Today, we base our understanding not only on observations in patients, but also on imaging studies with specific tasks in normal subjects. For this, we use what is called activation studies, meaning the patient does a task, and we compare the activity within the brain regions between this task and a control situation, which can be another simpler task or which can be rest and so on. Based on all these different aspects, a model has been developed whereby two regions in the left hemisphere contribute critically to our ability to speak, to have language. One is indeed Broca's area in the anterior part, here in pink, and the other one in blue is in the lateral lobe on the side, on the lateral aspect of the temporal lobe. It is interesting that between these regions there is a sort of motorway of axons in the white matter, and they are organized in two big pathways, one which goes this way and is called the dorsal pathway because it's up, and a ventral pathway here, which is a smaller one generally. We can today trace this pathway just to get you an idea how we know that it exists. Based on the diffusion properties of the white matter, we can calculate the probabilities what the predominant direction of axon is. Axon is something elongated, and at microscopic level, the liquid will move more freely along the axon than across them. And this can be appreciated by this technology. Then you can express the statistical probability, which are representative of axons, but they are not individual axons. We published this where we investigated the dorsal pathway in the left hemisphere, indeed from the Broca's area to the other speech area, but also the equivalent in the other hemisphere. This has been pushed a bit further by other groups and by these colleagues, American colleagues, in man, what contributes or how strong are the dorsal and ventral pathways in either hemisphere. They represent it differently. They represent in color code the regions which contribute to this pathway, and the more red it is, the stronger the input from the region to the pathway. The upper part, you have the left and the right hemisphere, and this is the connectivity via the dorsal pathway. And what you see, that it's more red on the left side, very red, than on the right side. This is the asymmetry of the dorsal pathway. When you look at the ventral pathway, not so dense, and above all, not really asymmetric. And then they did the same studies with chimpanzees. First of all, in chimpanzees, the dorsal fasciculus is not so strong, and the ventral is stronger. There may be minor asymmetry on the dorsal one, but not as prominent as in humans. And this is interesting. I will go back to the two previous slides. And these two pathways, in fact, support functionally something very important. This is the phonological processing, which allows us the discrimination between very nearby words with very different meanings. Processing, something which is specific for language. Now, obviously, you have read papers which say, oh, non-human primates have language, they communicate, it is sophisticated. It is true that they have a sort of communication system which uses vocalizations. But these communications mean simple things like danger, predator, food, and so on. And they don't use grammar or something like that. This is an example from marmoset monkeys, which are small monkeys. These are the spectrograms, audiograms of their calls, which indeed differ. They have also a system which encodes these calls, which involves, as in humans, the frontal cortex, not completely lateralized, and they have units which which encode listening to the call or producing it. It's a rudiment of a language system without the sophistication which we have. And they have a connectivity via a dorsal and ventral pathway. Okay, non-human species, they have something similar, but not so sophisticated. But if we think about it, we use our language to something completely different as well. There are several studies which looked into, for instance, the poetry. And one of them by American colleagues who looked into the processing of poetical figures. There are figures which are used in poetry and not in current language, and which give a strong meaning to the poetry. Look in what's happening. It's not only language areas which are used, because they have been subtracted in this comparison, but all of a sudden, other brain regions contribute to this creation, to this appreciation of poetic creation. Here's another study which has investigated generation of poetry or revision of poetry. And again, you have partially involvement of the speech regions, language regions, but much more which contributes. Is this ability to link in other aspects to the language to render it much more complex, which is also part of our human being. Thus, in summary, language is something fundamental for human beings. Some authors, like Chomsky, think that it's the basis of abstract thinking. There are other currents, and we can discuss it at coffee break. Then there is one thing, that we have a specific system for language areas within the left hemisphere, very nicely defined connectivity. But there are also these creative aspects of language which draw other regions, other brain regions in. When we go to non-human primates, we have only rudimentary systems which are reminiscent of what we have, but not so sophisticated. Now, I won't be going into the evolutionary aspect, but again, this can be discussed afterwards. Well, the second cognitive function I would like to highlight is theory of mind. This is a rather complex concept from cognitive neuroscience. It summarizes what allows us to recognize our own mental state and that of other people. It allows us to attribute intentions, knowledge, or desires to other people, to have an idea what they think. Finally, it gives us a representation of the world, of the universe, and we can conceive our own actions in function of that, plan them. It is something extremely important. I won't be going into all details, but just to tell you that this function, which sounds very complex, is indeed, and there are different aspects which contribute to what is called globally theory of mind. I mentioned that much of our knowledge about brain function is the result of imaging studies in normal subjects. You have one task and control task, and you look where is the difference in brain activity. It's a statistical calculation of differences, and this gives the nicely colored maps. Now, when you study something as complex as theory of mind, you can have a huge number of individual studies. What is current now to do meta-analysis, to take all the studies which use a same type of task or stimulus and compile the activation patterns, again, a statistical approach, to get a more global picture. And this has been done by Schurz and colleagues for different aspects of the theory of mind. It's a meta-analysis. And they picked up 6 different experimental paradigms. For instance, appreciating state of knowledge of others, personality traits of others, strategic games where you need to think what your adversary knows or thinks, social interactions, and you can have small cartoons with shapes for that, determine mental states from facial expressions or partial facial photographs, and determine logical outcome of an action. This meta-analysis, and these are the number of studies involved which they considered, highlighted the regions which look similar but slightly different. There are some regions which are frequently present, like this one in the parietal cortex, which comes up several times, or this one in the frontal part, in the anterior part between the hemispheres, again pops out several times. They have also analyzed, together with another group, which are the regions which seem to be important in all aspects of theory of mind. This is the first figure, and what comes out statistically is this parietal region, temporal cortex, prefrontal cortex, and on the medial part of the hemisphere, frontal and a posterior region. Now, some of these regions are involved almost in all tasks, others only in some aspects. And this is shown here. The red means these are the most tasks use this region, and when it comes to green, it's less involvement, only some of the tasks. Well, now, theory of mind, something specific to humans, question mark. This started over 40 years ago with a very influential paper by Premack and Woodruff, who published a paper with the title, "Does the Chimpanzee Have a Theory of Mind?" And they launched it as a sort of question to be investigated. First of all, the studies went rather slowly, but then there were very influential papers, which have shown that chimpanzees can understand what other chimpanzees can see and what they cannot see, which is in a scene. This has been done usually in freely behaving animals, where the issue was food or other animals. Other publications, chimpanzees know what others know, but not what they believe. And this comes to the fact of false beliefs. They can't appreciate whether that the other could have a false belief, think something which in fact is wrong. They basically, chimpanzees, as representative of non-human primates, have some level of theory of mind, but not really so sophisticated as in humans. Now, I would like to open a very brief window on something which is important and which is related to the theory of mind in a way. And that's the spiritual brain. This started at the same time as functional imaging. There were very first studies on esoteric meditation practices. And that was marvelous because it gave a content, a reality to something which was meant to be pure imagination. This is again a meta-analysis of a large number of studies, and the dots indicate summaries of different studies. What is interesting that on these aspects you see the highlighting more or less the same regions as in theory of mind. It's not exactly, but there is a similarity. But I am not an expert on meditation, and I would like to consider the question in the context of Christian faith. And basically, our faith, it's not meditation only. It is based on different aspects. It is the knowledge of the tenets of our faith. It is the decision to follow the faith. It is the confidence, the trust which we have in God and that He is with us. It is the relationship which we have in God. By the way, the use of faith and to believe in the Bible is not filling the gaps where we don't know, but it's to have a relationship, trust. And it is also the life of prayer, praise, sharing the faith with others in a church. And there can be, of course, spiritual, mystical, charismatic experiences. I am not denying it, but it's not only that. There's been a series of studies on the Christian or Jewish context of faith. And one is very interesting. It is a very thorough study published now 10 years ago, where they investigate several aspects of religious expression, which are part of religious life, with functional imaging. And their result was that, for instance, thinking about God involves parts of the brain, this is from their study, where in the anterior part of the brain. Now, this comment in Science put it in relation, compiled a large number of studies in which I evaluated the relationship to others. And you see that the clusters of activity are in the same region as the region which is involved in this particular aspect, thinking about the relationship with God. Basically, this study also showed other aspects of faith. In fact, the summary is that all we use for our faith are also systems which we use for the relationship with others, which we use for acquiring knowledge which is in the secular context. We do not have in our brains a spiritual module dedicated just to that. And this is something important to keep in mind. Well, summary on the theory of mind. It is something which is extremely important because it gives us a representation of our mental state and that of others. Through this, we can project us in this world and in future, for instance, also. There is a similarity between theory of mind and some aspects of spiritual representation, especially when it comes to relationships. And in non-human primates, we have something very rudimentary again, but not as developed as in humans. My third and last aspect are semantic representations. Semantic means relates to the meaning of things. And I will illustrate it on the example of expert knowledge. Sorry, it was mentioned this morning that our brain changes all the time, and it is true. It is interesting that even at adult age, a brief learning period changes how our brains how things are represented in our brain. And I will illustrate it by the example from one of our studies where we investigated recognition of bird species by their song. A doctoral student, Rosanna De Meo, undertook a study which seemed to be perhaps a bit exotic. She took songs of birds which were not commonly known, and medical and science students who learned during 1 hour to discriminate bird species by a specific training. They heard a song, different excerpts for songs. They saw the picture, the name, where the birds lived, and so on. Before that and after that, she registered from over 120 electrodes evoked potentials to samples of different songs from the learned species and from control species. And she made an analysis, statistical analysis, of the changes in activity. Basically, what comes out that to become an expert in discriminated birdsong, it's not your audition which is important, but you change the representation in regions of the brain, here the frontal cortex, here the temporal cortex mainly, for the trained species. And these regions are known to bear semantic representations, usually which combine different sensory modalities, like audition, vision, and so on. This brief training changed the representation of what was learned, where 1 hour, and it changed. And this is interesting. This is happening all the time when we learn something. Now, is it important what we learn? What influence? Is it important to learn, to recognize an exotic bird species, or even a bird species here, beyond the pleasure which it can give to hear them? Well, it is. And it is for two different aspects which I will illustrate. One is that our knowledge which we have acquired, helps us to understand what we perceive. And here is an extreme example, again from one of our studies. Again, the same doctoral student, Rosanna De Meo, who did it. Medical students and young doctors have find it very difficult to analyze cardiac auscultation. You know, you can listen to the heartbeat, and one heart cycle is tak tak, one heartbeat, and it follows one per second roughly. And between these two taks, which follow very rapidly, there can be noises, which mean certain pathological conditions, or each of the taks can be split. And it's very difficult to perceive. And again, it's a powerful diagnostic tool. There is a Johns Hopkins Medical School has a whole program in the United States to train the students. And they think, you know, we should train them to discriminate sounds. That will be the way in doing it. We collaborated with Ray Thompson, who is the head of this cardiac auscultation unit, and he is a pediatric cardiologist. He gave us the stimuli. And frankly, what we did, we picked up something which was acoustically easy. We picked up the splits of the different sounds. Basically, you can have single sounds. This is one heart cycle, a second heart cycle, and you can have single sounds or split like here, or even split here. It doesn't come out well on this slide. And you can just barely hear it. Students, medical students who are well trained and who have learned, had their courses on cardiology, anatomy, physiology, radiology, pathology, know a lot about the heart. They have learned to auscultate. They do about 75% correct of saying what it is. Basically, we use this with a paradigm which is often used in cognitive neuroscience. You have this very difficult condition. You register evoked potentials, and then you compare evoked potentials to the correct diagnosis and to the failed one. This means you are identifying what is necessary to tap in order to succeed. And we did that. These are the different steps of reconstruction of it, the calculations. And this is the region which makes the difference. It is not in the auditory cortex. We can reveal activity on the auditory cortex. It's not a methodological problem. But it is this semantic representation. Basically, at this very difficult situation where you can barely hear the difference, the success is to link it to what you know before, meaning the knowledge which we have can influence in these very difficult conditions how we perceive it. It is obviously, it would say that for making good cardiologists for auscultation, they need to be first good cardiologists and know all about it. This is one aspect. Now, my third example is a different one. Everybody asks, isn't it bad to have all these smartphones and everything? Doesn't it change the brain of our children? Well, probably, yes. But what did even more change our brains, and certainly does still now, is an innovation from the 15th century, which is, as you guessed, the press, the printing of books. This is an example of the facsimile of the first Bible printed by Gutenberg. It's in Latin, and it's not example of the books as we see them today. But by this, by printing the books, there was a need to unify the way of writing a language which allowed the rapid reading which we can do. We skim few words very rapidly. We do not need to read it letter by letter as which you need to do if the writing of a language is not regular. I will explain to you how it changed our brain in 2 steps. The first step will be to speak to you about face recognition, and the second one about reading. Well, to speak about this face recognition, I would like to quote an example of a patient we have examined. At that time, she was 50 years old. She was a keen mountaineer. She sustained a very severe mountaineering accident, and she had lesions in the brain. We examined her because she was unable to work for different reasons, and that was just a standard examination for that. It was interesting. She had normal vision, except one thing. She could not recognize people she had known before. She had what is called prosopagnosia, prosopon, face in Greek, agnosia from knowing, gnosis. And this remained from the accident on and was very debilitating. She saw people from her own family she knew from her childhood, and unless the person spoke or had something distinctive on them, she was unable to recognize them. She had also difficulties in recognizing known buildings, and in the valley where she lived, you know, in Switzerland, you know all the mountains around, you'd give names. She couldn't do it, although she has been on most of them. However, she could recognize that it was a face, how, if it was a man or a woman, what age, what facial expression. Sometimes she could guess what profession the person could have, like actors versus politicians or whatever. It was something very specific. And her lesion, this is an MRI which was done, was in the lower part of the temporal lobe. There was a hematoma which has been removed surgically. This region was damaged by the hematoma. Well, the explanation of her deficit is that this region is involved in the very specific aspect of face recognition and the recognition of other categories. This is a paper of Grill-Spector and her colleagues. And what they did, they have a model of the brain which they inflate slightly, and then they show on it what regions are activated. So you see even in the folds of the brain. Here, you see the regions which are activated specifically by faces. And you see exactly this region which was damaged bilaterally in the patient. You have nearby a region which are specific for bird recognition of flowers, different flower species, or houses and so on, known houses. We have a whole system which allows us to recognize specific aspects. Among these specific aspects is also the recognition, visual recognition of words. Words like cat, house, and so on, you can read it extremely rapidly, visually, purely visually, and this relies also on part of the same region. It is called the visual word form area. This region receives input from the visual cortex, which is in the back, gives information, interconnects with the two speech areas in the left hand. Stanislas Dehaene from Paris and his group looked into the development of this region. And they did a series of wonderful studies in children. They studied children who had normal schooling, who learned reading, and perfectly normal children who were not schooled, who could not read at the time of the study. Not that they had some neurological deficits, it was just that they did not have the occasion to study. In children who acquire reading and are 6 years old, they represent here in the posterior part of the brain, here, in activations by words, visual words, by faces, all sorts of objects, represented by houses, or without meaning. Well, in 6-year-old children who acquired reading, you see basically this visual word form area which stands out, and you see on the other side an area which is involved in face recognition rather selectively. You don't, and this develops even further at the age of 9 years. It is interesting that when the child does not have the opportunity to learn to read, this differentiation within the brain doesn't take place. This means that the ability to read changes the configuration of our brain, which goes beyond the reading or language. It influences also the differentiation for other aspects. I will jump that one. We have in our brain these specialized networks which allows us to be experts. These networks change progressively through life, through our experience, learning, to what we live. To a certain extent, the expertise, even in a sensory modality like audition, depends on our multisensory semantic representations. Now, one thing is important here. We have these multisensory representations, but they are not innate. In fact, they come through learning. They come through other people. They come through external representations, and this external representation can be a book. Basically, our semantic system is the result not only of our brain is the substrate, but of interactions with other, interactions between generations, and between populations. Now, very briefly, how this could be useful to our understanding of when humankind really with these abilities appeared. There are two ways of approaching it. One is brain organization. This is difficult because you need the brain to appreciate it. One way of looking at it is brain size. And this is body versus brain size from this study in living animal species and in man. Basically, it is interesting. It contributes more pronounced relationship between size, but it's only the size which is important. It's, for instance, also the folding and the configuration of the brain. We can't keep it. When you look into the past, you need to rely on what is called endocranial volume. Basically, within the skull, you measure the volume, presuming that most of it, or the same proportion, will be used by the brain. So it's a good approximation. And there are curves for Homo sapiens here, Homo neanderthalis. We heard the brain was slightly bigger, and other hominids and other great apes here, Australopithecus here. It is a way, but it's not really, it doesn't tell us how it was used. One interesting approach concerns the Paleolithic. I have talked to you about semantic representation, external semantic representations, which can transmit knowledge. And there is a lot of cave art in different parts of the world. I'm really relying on publications of others. Sometimes this cave art is not just artistic representation, but it looks like an encyclopedia. You have, for instance, drawings of hooves. The horse, which is a non-split hoof, there are split hooves, probably belonging to another species. When you go to Lascaux, where you can't visit the original one nowadays by a copy, you have here a drawing of a painting of a horse, and the hoof is not split. I'm sorry. And here it's the split hoof of bull, which means interpret these sort of details like the type of food which these animals need. There are indications on their habits, which are probably useful to hunt them and so on. One interpretation, which has been proposed by an English researcher, Mitten, is that this may be some sort of transmission of knowledge. And it does not concern only the visual aspect. These are two renderings by two archaeologists of a sort of semi-sculpture from the ceiling in Altamira of a bellowing stag, meaning producing sounds. When you hear something which is produced like that, there are sounds which can signal animals. Right. We have probably somewhere in the Paleolithic signs that people used external representation, that they may have transmitted a semantic information between individuals. I can't comment more on that, but I found it very interesting and intriguing. Now, I told you that what being human is in the brain for a big part. The complexity of the human brain differentiates us from non-human species, from artificial intelligence, but it's not only our brain, it's also the interactions with other individuals, cultures, and so on. How does it fit with the biblical concept? And I would highlight it. I will be repeating some of the things, which is perhaps lucky. 4 points to signal the difference in the purpose of the of cognitive neuroscience description and the biblical message. Well, I'm coming back to Genesis, and I won't read the verse again. It has been quoted just before, but it says why humankind was put on earth. It was as God's stewards and image bearers. And perhaps one of the things to stress, which I would like to stress, I don't think others did it before, when you look into the other creation stories around roughly at the same time, the gods were the powerful ones, and sometimes, apparently, they created men so that they had servants for the dirty tasks. And this says exactly the different. This is a completely different message. It is not only for the lowly tasks, but it is to serve our God and to represent Him in a certain way here on earth. I would like to quote Acts. Paul is at the Areopagus, and he speaks to the Athenians, and he says, God made the world and everything in it. He does not live in temples built by human hands. He's not served by humans. We are not here to serve him blindly in lowly tasks. But he gives life and breath for things. And he points out created man so that man seeks him and reaches out for him. This is the relationship part. We are created for looking for God. Again, I'm taking up the same quotation from Psalm 8, as has been already mentioned. I used it for my medical thesis. I had 5 papers, and I put that on the. You can do many things in Switzerland in a thesis, as a citation on the first page, and got all sorts of comments. But I think it says, in one hand, indeed, humankind is marvelous. I was absolutely fascinated by brain organization already then. But one quotation, you made them rulers over the works of your hands. You put everything under their feet. It could be under our feet, but there is an indication when we go to the New Testament that there is a slightly different reading, and that, and I go to Hebrews. In Hebrew 1, the author speaks about how superior Christ is to the angels. He says also that the angels will not rule the coming world, but that it will be the humans who, through their faith, after resurrection. And he took up this same verse that God puts everything under their feet. And this can be interpreted as under our feet, but under our feet through Jesus Christ. In fact, there are some other translations which clearly say under his feet, that he will rule everything. Therefore, the biblical message is, indeed, we are created for a purpose, for the relationship with God, so that we seek him, and we come to our accomplishment as human beings through Jesus Christ. And this is a message which is not addressed in this way, obviously, in cognitive neuroscience. Well, as a reply to my task, yes, our brain is important, as are the interactions, our culture. Basically, there is not a contradiction of cognitive neuroscience and the Bible. They look at the human being in different ways. Well, this is from a mountaineering course, which a couple of years ago, we took photograph of the group before us. And basically summarizes what it is being human. It is marvelous. It is not always easy. There is a purpose in life, but there are sometimes periods which are difficult, where we need to fight, where we need to make a big effort. But we are not alone in that. We have our fellow beings, and we have a guide. This is the mountaineering guide here. We have a guide in Jesus Christ, and I think this is something extremely important. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you very much. That was fascinating. Got some time for questions. So hands are up.
Thank you. My question is about music specifically and memory. I don't personally have had the experience where you learned something, you studied it, it was fascinating, you took your exams, And, you know, maybe a month later, 2 months later, years later, you're very fuzzy. You don't remember it as well. But at the same time, you know, you can remember paragraphs of seemingly meaningless lyrics, right, set to music. Right? You know, the idea that some of the hymns of our faith, like these are theological truths set to music, and they stick with you in a way that sometimes just words themselves spoken don't. So I'm wondering, in terms of the brain and music, is it true from neuroscience that music does help us to remember things, and how they're connected, if they are connected?
Thank you. Learning is a complicated matter, but basically, if you can encode what you have to learn in a multi-sensory way or with different channels, you will strengthen the memory trace, if I may say so, in the brain. Basically, if you have learned to learn, when we learned anatomy, what we did, we have looked where the things are, we repeated to each other with my fellow students and so on, so that it remains. Music can facilitate that because you have a perception of rhythm, you remember the melody, which helps you perhaps to remember the words. It has an emotional impact. Probably it activates sometimes one of the reward systems, the dopaminergic system, which is known to strengthen connections. It can be multiple, but it's not in everybody the same thing. It depends. It can be slightly personal.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for your talk. My question is about what is in your brain and what it is true. I just would like to say to you that I'm assuming that there's a spiritual truth according to the Christian faith, so this is my presupposition as well. I mean, I just would like to give 2 examples just to give a context to my question. The first example is, I know some Christians that says that during his period of coma, he have a spiritual experience with God and he talked to God about some personal things. This is the first example.
So it was somebody in coma.
Yeah, something in coma.
Yeah.
And the second example, it is some person that truly believe that all things that went wrong to her life and all accidents that he suffered in her life was a punishment from God. This is a second example. So the first example, I mean, could be reliable if, the person could have some credibility to say that during a period of coma he talked to God. And the second example, the way that I see the Bible doesn't seem true that God is punishing someone. Everything that went wrong is because God's fault. So these two examples just give a context to my question. That is, some person could have different interpretations of the Bible. This could be very true in her brain, in her personal experience, but not necessarily a truth or a spiritual truth. But it is something very real for the person. So how could we Christians deal with this kind of problem? People that says that a lot of things are true, but they don't have basis for it. And I don't know, do you understand what I'm trying to say? What this represents for me? I don't know if the question is very clear. Is it clear for you? Yeah.
Okay, very good question. I will pass on the first part and relay it to Michael Wang, who will be talking exactly about that. Is that true? Yeah. So the second one, our perception of what happens to us. It is a very important question. It's not only for the person, the family, but also sometimes for church communities. Sometimes you can have different aspects superimposed. Very long time ago, I saw a patient who came as an outpatient, sent by our colleagues from ear, nose specialties. She had a apparently degenerative disease of the brainstem, meaning the nuclei which relay, among others, auditory information. And she had very little deficits, but she was hearing from time to time sounds like the old heatings in her house banging and things like that. And she had the impression that every time it happened, there was something bad which came afterwards. It was perceived as premonitory. And she was an active member of a church, and when I saw her the second time, because we couldn't do much for her. She had a normal audition, but there were these events which were linked very likely to this degenerative disease, the perception of the noises. And they went through with her through these experiences, and it is true that in her life there were very bad things happened. I mean, there were tragic deaths and in her family and so on. And finally, with her, with the people in her church, they were able to determine that it was not premonitory. She was able to perceive the love of God despite these events in her life and despite these noises. We went through her, we explained to her how the problem which she had in the brainstem could make her perceive things which are not there, which other people do not perceive. And that helped sometimes to try to understand and to separate different levels of interpretation. Now, does it answer a bit your question? Not. Okay. I think it's to a good part a theological question. How do you, personally, when there is a doubt, not a doubt about what I believe, but about interpretation of events in life, I have the tendency to go back to the Bible text, to try to understand what the Bible says, to share with other people and at the church, to have an appreciation which seemed to be solidly based. It can be important in some contexts when you have so-called words of knowledge. I don't know how common it is in different churches, but there are some who can have it pretty often, and it can disturb some people. But I think it's important to dismiss them or say, yes, they are absolutely true, but to examine them in a wider context of Christian fellowship.
Well, thank you. There was an experiment by Franz de Waals with monkeys. So he gave two monkeys that were separate. So in the beginning they gave cucumbers to both monkeys, and then from point on they started giving grapes to one of the monkeys, and the other one was mad for it. But after a time, the one that was receiving grapes stopped eating them. So it was interpreted as indicating that monkeys have a moral something. They understand moral. And my question is, could other animals develop a cognitive brain or language? As you said, they have some words. Dolphins, for instance, they can call them man's names, I think, but they don't have grammar and poems and this figurative language as we do. But could they develop it?
Okay, there is a whole field of this in link also with the initial study by Premak. Can we teach apes or big monkey, apes, human language? They were raised in families. There was a whole movement in that. And they could learn use abstract things to express content. There were some indications that they could learn grammar, some aspects of grammar, but very, very rudimentary. And it seemed to be easier, that's anecdotal evidence, when they started very young. This is my observation, where the mother was the object of the study, but the young ones followed and apparently had more facilities with that. But you can't have the same thing. That's pretty well established and pretty well accepted. Yeah.
Thank you very much for a spectacular talk. In our worship, there's a lot of ways of saying, as it was in the beginning, is now, and shall be forever. Do you believe, I mean, as a room full of people chiefly in a sort of post-Enlightenment Western tradition, I think we have a particular notion of time. Is this partly related to the way we use, that we are trained in our language from our earliest days? But do you think our notion of time is a very learned behavior and is mandatory, or is mandatory in us?
Very good question. In people of our cultural context, which had schooling, and people who, most studies have been done in people who, with European type of languages, there is this very firm notion that time or representation of time goes from left to right. There is indirect evidence from people who have conditions like neglect, where they neglect part of the space, generally the left one, and you can get shifts in time, or you can manipulate spatial representation by illusions, and then you have indirect evidence, probably, that you shift the representation over the time. Now, is it culturally caused, or is it something general? This is unclear.